Gunfire Reborn is my favorite FPS roguelite, and I strongly recommend that you check it out. It was one of the best roguelites they played in 2021, and I'm glad the subgenre of FPS roguelites has been getting more attention recently. That being said, there are a couple areas that really could be improved. So let's get into it. Gunfire Reborn is a co-op looter-shooter RPG roguelite set in a mythical world with humanoid animals. The core gameplay involves clearing areas of enemies to progress, followed by a Borderlands-like looting system. The game is split into 3 or 4 different acts with different themes and enemy types. Each act is split into a couple levels that lead up to a final boss. The gameplay itself is responsive and rewarding. Overall, the game feels great to play through. You play as one of 6 heroes. Each group have one primary ability on a cooldown, a secondary ability that relies on an ammo count, and a passive ability that you don't actively control. You'll also always have access to a dash that you can use to move around faster or dodge incoming attacks. I quite like the class design and variety between the heroes in Gunfire Reborn. Each hero really favors a distinct playstyle. I had fun killing everyone with headshots as the sniper Snow Leopard before swapping to the melee-focused Bird hero, where you can really jump in there, leap around, and melee everyone. You can also unlock cross-run buffs or upgrades, but we'll talk more about that heavy vertical progression a little later on in this video. Within each run, there are 3 main elements that make up your build, and the game has overall great build crafting and RPG elements. First, you have your class-specific traits, and you get most of these traits for completing each level. You always have an option of a couple traits to choose from, and each hero has a couple of traits for their primary ability, their secondary ability, and their passive ability. So you can choose which aspect of that hero you want to prioritize, you want to work with. Second, your build includes your actual weapons. You'll get most weapons as random drops from enemies, but you can also buy weapons from certain shops. Weapons range from standard assault rifle guns to more mythical weapons like magical swords or a dragon flamethrower. And I quite like the variety and design of these weapons as a whole. Some weapons also have an alternative firing ability, which can be really fun. For example, one gun lets you throw it like a grenade to explode if you want to do that instead of firing it normally. Each weapon will also have several inscriptions that modify the weapon in various ways. They might give increased critical hit damage, they might give decreased accuracy but a higher firing rate, things like that. You can also level up your weapon at a smith to increase its base damage and re-roll their inscriptions once you've unlocked the ability to do so. These modifiers can range from incredibly powerful, almost overpowered, to basically useless. So it makes looting in the game more similar to traditional looter shooters, where you have to actually take a second to read the drops before you can tell if it's actually good or not. A weapon can seem good at a first glance, but actually be useless, or vice versa, depending on what inscriptions or modifiers you find, and how those modifiers either work with that weapon or the rest of your build. I really liked the weapon looting in the game for a lot of my playtime, but I had a couple problems with it as I played more. One, after a while, you start to realize a lot of the drops suck, or they don't fit your character's playstyle, so you just ignore them or recycle them if you've unlocked that ability. Second, I realized one of the best strategies in the game for certain characters is to just take one of their early weapons and just repeatedly upgrade it or level it up as you go through the game. I kind of disliked how successful I found this method to be, because it basically meant I didn't care about looting for the rest of the run once I found that weapon early on. Looting became useless in those runs because of that method. The final aspect of build crafting in this game are the occult scrolls, which are not class specific. Most scrolls are direct buffs of some sort, for example, decreasing your dash cooldown to let you dash more often. But some unlocks add new mechanics, such as one scroll that lets you break pots to get more loot, and there are also other scrolls that have a powerful effect with some drawback attached to it. So for example, there's one scroll that gives you a nice damage stacking buff for each kill that you have, but it also gives you a corresponding stacking debuff that makes you take more damage. A little risk reward there, which can be nice to play around with. I found most of these scrolls fell into one of 2 categories. Ones that were basically always helpful to have, decreased dash cooldown that I talked about earlier, and ones that were incredibly niche or build specific. Scrolls that you would basically ignore unless you're running a certain character or even a certain build for that character. One scroll halves your weapon damage, but doubles how many hits you do. This scroll is absolutely amazing for the bunny hero because it meshes, standardizes with their on-hit effects, but it's basically useless for most classes, and it's actually harmful for the Snow Leopard that relies on more powerful single-tick abilities. I think having these niche scrolls was fine, but it also led to a situation where you'd find some scrolls and they'd just be useless a lot of the time. It made more dead loot, so to speak. One thing I really liked about Gunfire Reborn is how most of these scrolls are locked in vaults, which are optional, short side rooms you can complete in order to gain scrolls or other rewards. These might be mini bosses, obstacle courses, or other specific combat challenges. I think these vaults are a great risk-reward mechanic in the game, where you decide whether you want to risk a certain challenge in order to get another scroll, flesh out your build, or whether it's best to avoid it and keep the run going. Collectively, between these different build elements, Gunfire Reborn really shines in that RPG looter-shooter quality for most of my playtime through it. And that's one of the reasons that I enjoyed the game so much. It was just fun to standardize effects, plan around them, match my weapons and my traits, even if some of these elements became more dull at the end of my playthrough. Outside of the builds, the combat also utilizes 3 different condition effects. Each condition can combo with other conditions to create hybrid conditions. Stacking shock and decay can create miasma, which deals a percentage of the enemy's max health over time, which makes it particularly useful for bosses and enemies on higher difficulties. I like these condition effects, and I liked how they combo with each other to create new effects. I also liked how each condition countered a certain enemy type. So for example, shock damage deals more damage to shields, while decay deals more damage to armored enemies. And on that note, one really important aspect of Gunfire Reborn's design is that the game really feels designed around co-op for me. Most of my time playing the game, I played solo, and I had a lot of fun playing solo. It's definitely a solo-friendly game, but a lot of the game mechanics felt a lot better in co-op, felt a lot better in multiplayer. For example, getting those strong combined condition effects is a lot easier in multiplayer when you have 2 separate players applying each condition, as opposed to trying to apply multiple conditions on your own. And while a lot of the loot between the scrolls and the weapons are useless for each individual class, if you have a team of multiple different heroes, you can share some of those weapons or scrolls to people who actually benefit from them. And most importantly, co-op has the ability to revive your teammates. You actually always have the ability to revive yourself once per run at the cost of some soul essence, which are the long-term cross-run currency of the game. But in co-op, you can revive your teammates an infinite number of times. Gunfire Reborn doesn't necessarily have one-shot kills. I think it explicitly has one-shot kill protection, but the game does have a lot of times where you'll die very, very quickly. And that's probably my main complaint with the game when playing solo. It's just not fun to be insta-killed like that, but it's basically not a problem at all in co-op because it's so easy to revive your teammates, and those insta-kills are just much less punishing. Outside of that insta-kill potential, the base movement speed in the game for some characters just feels really slow and can make the game feel sluggish at times when you first start playing it. After I would play a run or two of the game, I forgot about it, I got used to it, but if I swapped from a game that was more fast-paced to Gunfire Reborn, I always noticed that sluggish quality, and it took me a second to adjust to the slower movement speed. Now let's talk about the randomness and variety in the game. A lot of run-to-run randomness in the game comes in the form of what loot you find and how that fleshes out your build. I think Gunfire Reborn strikes a decent balance between being able to determine what type of build you want for a given run before you start, and being forced to work with what you have, what you're given, what loot you find along the way. But I found that realistically speaking, most classes had only 2, and sometimes had only 1 type of build that felt a lot better than the others. Additionally, a lot of builds have 1 or 2 critical traits that make that build so much stronger if you have it. So whether you get that particular trait or not is an aspect where RNG has an important role in your build. You will pretty much always eventually get that important trait, but whether you get that trait in the first act, on the first level, or whether you pick it up right before the final boss can have a big impact on your run. Additionally, which inscriptions or modifiers you can get for a certain weapon can have a huge impact on how good they are. This, mechanically, was quite enjoyable at first, and it's really fun to find an overpowered weapon with a bunch of stacked inscriptions. I plowed my way through a bunch of levels after getting a semi-automatic crossbow, which did automatic critical hits when I scoped in. And it was just fun to find that weapon as a surprise and crush through these levels with it. But on the other hand, as I talked about earlier, you can start to ignore most loot in the game when you start to min-max, realize what's good, realize what isn't, realize what modifiers will ruin a gun for you, those kind of things. I have a mostly positive opinion on the enemy variety and level design in Gunfire Reborn. I think the game has decent enemy variety and enemy types that are countered by different playstyles. I also liked how each area and biome felt really distinct, and I liked how they all had separate enemy pools to play around with. But on the other hand, you get the exact same enemies in the exact same levels each time you play the game. There are some more variation in the optional elite rooms or vaults, but in the main level, the main path, the third level of Act 2, for example, will always have the exact same enemies and will always have a very similar level design and layout. I guess what I mean is, I think the enemy variety and design is good, but the runs start to feel very predictable over time. Also, some of the sniper enemies are really annoying and have high insta-kill potential, and sometimes these enemies even hit you when you think you're behind cover, which is frustrating. One thing that higher difficulties have that increases the variety is having enemies sometimes get random modifiers. For example, some enemies randomly get a shield or more health. I think this is a great addition to the game that helped that predictability and made the game feel more lively. But I do wish they removed the immortal prefix that made enemies live for 5 seconds after you killed them, especially for the swarming enemies. It was just annoying and unfun to me to kill an enemy, have to hide behind a corner, wait 5 seconds for them to die. In the same vein, there are some random events you can run across that make all enemies in an area have an additional effect. They might explode on death, they might spawn a swarming enemy on death, those kind of things that just freshen up the rooms a little bit. There are also 2 different bosses for each of the first 3 acts, and this boss variety is great because these bosses felt mechanically distinct from each other. As a more minor complaint, I do think some bosses have a weird learning curve where they feel basically impossible when you first start playing them, but they quickly feel very trivial once you figure out how to beat them. One aspect I enjoyed about Gunfire Reborn is how they handled the 4th act in the game, which was added near the end of its development cycle. Basically, the 4th area is treated as optional. You can always complete a run after the 3rd boss and get credit for a win. However, the 4th area introduces a new set of enemies and a new final boss that adds new mechanics to navigate. There were some complaints about how that boss was structured at first, and I think it feels fine now, whereas previously, it really punished non-DPS focused playstyles. Taken as a whole, Gunfire Reborn has a good balance of RNG factors and factors you have control over. You're given enough weapons to loot through, and enough traits and scrolls to create a fun build. But over time, as I started to learn the systems of the game, I found that each run became much more predictable, partly because of build optimization on my part, and partly because of the predictable level design that doesn't have that much randomness variety baked into it. Now let's talk about progression and replayability in Gunfire Reborn. And this game has 3 main systems for run-to-run progression. First are the achievement-based unlocks for weapons and scrolls. As you're playing through the game, completing certain achievements will add new scrolls or weapons to your item pool, as well as dropping that item immediately for you to try out on that run. Most of the achievements are pretty straightforward. An achievement might be kill X number of a certain type of enemy or kill a boss 3 times, but a couple achievements are more niche. I think the system worked quite well in Gunfire Reborn and added a nice new horizontal progression system or variety element to the game. As I mentioned earlier, it's fun to try out all these different weapons, though again, some of them are much stronger for certain builds or heroes than others. You usually won't actively work towards these goals, actively try to unlock these guns, but these achievements do tend to reward you for trying things out, like completing certain vaults or completing games on higher difficulty levels. And on that note, the second main type of progression in the game were the difficulty levels that you unlock run to run. There are 3 normal difficulty levels, and then 8 levels of reincarnation. Going up each difficulty level adds more enemy spawns and gives the enemies more health, more damage, things like that. But more than that, certain difficulty levels add in new mechanics to the game. I think this aspect of adding new mechanics with new difficulty levels was really well handled. Sure, stat increases to enemies can be nice, they can be fine, but the addition of new enemy modifiers in the jump from normal to elite, for example, made that difficulty change feel a lot more substantial. Additionally, the reincarnation mode adds a whole new merchants and gameplay choices that use soul essence, that permanent cross-run currency. And this adds more strategy, more planning, more build crafting ability, those kind of things. And on that note, let's talk about the 3rd main progression system in the game, the skill tree. While soul essence has some other uses in the game, unlocking new characters, allowing you to do a single revive for each run, the main use of soul essence in Gunfire Reborn is unlocking upgrades in a powerful skill tree. These skills are clustered into a couple different categories, such as one focused on looting and one focused more on weapon damage. There's also a skill tree, or really a skill line, for each of the characters in the game that gives them 5 skills that can be unlocked for each of them. While some of these are more simple buffs, other character-specific upgrades feel basically necessary to unlock before you're actually fully playing the character. For example, the armor regeneration that you unlock for the melee bird hero felt incredibly important for tackling certain bosses where melee was not viable. Similarly, a lot of more general upgrades are pure stat increases, such as increased health or increased critical hit damage. But there are also very important mechanical upgrades as well. There is one that allows you to upgrade a weapon more on each run, and there's one that adds Gemini inscriptions to your guns, which give your 2 weapons a strong buff if they have a matching pair of special inscriptions. I really loved unlocking these new mechanics to the game, and I felt they opened up the strategy and build crafting of the game even more. But you do have to commit a good chunk of time to get past these pure stat buffs, these pure upgrades, to actually unlock the new gameplay mechanics that shuffle things up a bit. The buffs in this game are quite powerful and really add up over time, run to run. Some people love these cross-run upgrades in roguelites, and some people hate them. But for me, the bigger question is if there are stat buffs in the game, does it have good pacing, or do I ever get stuck and feel like I need to grind? And on that note, I have mixed opinions about the vertical progression in Gunfire Reborn. I think the skill tree fits the overall vibe of the game. I think the pacing is mostly fine. Even 30 to 40 hours into the game, you almost always can unlock an upgrade or something after each game. You collect soul essence for killing enemies, so even if you fail a run halfway through, you get basically half the soul essence that you would for a successful run. So it doesn't feel like failed runs were a waste of time progression-wise, and I quite like that about the game. But the unlock pacing had a couple pressure points for me personally. First, you start off really weak, and you don't stop feeling super weak until you've done a decent amount of progression in unlocks. Second, the highest difficulty level you've unlocked is not always the one that rewards you with the most soul essence per unit time. So there is some tension between trying to climb difficulty levels versus efficiently farming soul essence to get more upgrades. And third, you're rewarded more soul essence for playing co-op as opposed to playing solo. That's because soul essence drops per enemy killed and more units spawn in co-op modes. Combined with the insta-kill potential and the ability for revives, as I talked about earlier, the progression in the game feels more balanced around co-op. Again, I played the game mostly solo, I had a lot of fun with it, but the game feels engineered for co-op play. But this design around co-op also makes the meaningful and powerful cross-run upgrades a slightly weird choice at times, because it creates co-op problems when the players are at different levels. This is obviously not a novel problem. Gunfire Reborn is not the first game to have this problem. MMOs have had to deal with this for quite a long time. But it's weird to have a roguelite design this way, where playing with a friend at a different level feels so unbalanced. One of you will face roll content, while the other of you will die frequently because of those level differences. Basically, if you're playing with a friend, I strongly recommend trying to level together somewhat closely if you want that best experience possible, because if you get too far apart, it will make the game worse. Collectively, I think the package of cross-run progression in Gunfire Reborn is good. I liked the scroll and weapon unlocks. I loved the introduction of new gameplay mechanics at higher difficulties, and I loved to unlock new gameplay mechanics in the skill tree. I just think the pacing and balancing of some of these upgrades and unlocks could have been better and would have made the game more enjoyable. Now let's talk briefly about the narrative and story in Gunfire Reborn. The game doesn't really have an overarching narrative, which is not surprising for a roguelite, but it does have a minimal amount of lore, and you get some dialogue for defeating the final boss for the first time. It's not really going to scratch that story itch, but there is some minimal world building there. So what's my overall verdict on Gunfire Reborn? I think Gunfire Reborn is a great game that's worth your time if you're into roguelites or into FPS games, and it's especially great as a co-op multiplayer experience for up to 4 players. The game feels good, and the RPG and build crafting elements that arise from different scrolls, weapons, characters, and skill trees are all satisfying to play around with. The biggest divisive elements of the game come from the super heavy vertical progression and how much the game feels balanced and designed around co-op, which comes at the expense of certain cons, certain drawbacks for solo play. Outside of that, most of my other complaints with the game only really started to bother me after about 20 to 30 hours of playing. That includes things like the predictability of the levels, and how the whole looting system feels trivialized in certain circumstances. That being said, even at full price, the game is only $20, so I definitely recommend giving it a go if you haven't already. Huge shout out to all of our channel members who help make videos like this one possible. I truly appreciate all of your support. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.